remember, all this privatization you hear about, it's supposed to be very efficient. And by some measure, by some ludicrous measure, it probably is efficient. And part of the reason why it's efficient is you don't count the costs, okay? So like if you suppose, they're talking about privatizing the MTA around here, the public transportation thing. All right, suppose you privatize the system. You and I know how to make it more efficient by the economist's measures. You throw out union workers and you get temps for half the price. And if there's an accident because they never had any training, well, it's just people are getting killed. You don't measure that. And you cut off the so-called unprofitable bus routes, okay, or subway routes. Like you don't make a lot of money at 11 p.m., okay, so let's throw them out. Well, suppose somebody's stuck somewhere at 11 p.m. and wants to get home. Oh, well, it's entrepreneurial values, Let them hire a limousine or something, And in ways like that, you can make the system more efficient simply by transferring the costs over to the public where you don't measure the costs, okay? So, it looks nice and efficient on some economist's paper, but of course there's huge costs transferred over to the public which you don't measure. We all know this, and that's what privatizing the educational system will be. Also, it's doing something else. It's going after exactly that moral conception that underlies the labor movement from its origins. Namely, we're in it together. It's not just gain wealth forgetting all but self. Like we should care not only that my kid can go to school, but the kid down the street can go to school. That's what's being driven out of people's heads. There's a very powerful effort to drive any of that out of people's heads. You're only supposed to care about yourself, unless you're rich, of course. If you're rich, you're part of big socialist structures called corporations with strategic alliances and plenty of support from the state, and then you're allowed to have all these feelings about, yeah, we work together for us, the rich guys. But everybody else is supposed to be on their own. You're not supposed to care whether the kid down the street goes to school. It's like breaking, it should be very familiar to people in the labor movement. This is the main propaganda against the labor movement all the time. Right to work laws, everything else. You shouldn't work together. That's bad. If you work together, you might do something that matters, okay? So just be out on your own, and if you can get a voucher so maybe your kid can go to school, forget about everything else. Look, this is very much a business-run society, about the last figures I saw, about $1 out of $6 in the whole economy is spent on marketing. It's an extremely inefficient use of funds, of course. Marketing doesn't produce any public goods, but marketing is a form of manipulation and deceit. It's an effort to create artificial wants, to put people, to control the way people look and think about things. A lot of that marketing is straight propaganda, advertising. Incidentally, most of it is tax-free, or a lot of it is tax-free, which means the way our system works, you pay for the privilege of being propagandized, of having all this stuff dumped on you. Those are not small figures. That's like $1 trillion a year in 1992, something on that order. And yes, these when you've got that much of a commitment to controlling minds and manipulating desires and so on, and doing all the things they talk about in the public relations literature, I'm not making it up, you can read it there, and the social science literature, because this is also standard academic talk too. Well, when you've got those stakes, you're going to work on it hard, and it's going to be hard to fight against. That's what makes organizing tough. It's not just, well, you know way better than me, and I'm not going to talk about it, but you have to break through a lot of psychic resistance. The whole history of the labor movement tells you that. And as I say, this was well understood by mill hands in Lowell 150 years ago. But yeah, it's a big battle. And you're not just struggling against somebody who calls it a right to work act. You're struggling against 5 hours a day of television and the movie industry and the books and the schools and everything else. The scale of the efforts to win the battle for men's minds is enormous. I mean, I thought I knew something about this stuff, but when I read Elizabeth Phone's Wolf book, I was pretty shocked just to see the scale of the efforts. And the dedication, the frenzied dedication to winning this everlasting battle. It's really pretty impressive, although if you think of the stakes, it's not too surprising.
I was curious about your remarks about the mill hands of Lowell, and that maybe the best idea was for them to own the firms themselves.
Okay, let's just talk about the principle. Okay, I mean, the principle, as far as I can see, goes right back to the Enlightenment. You know, like if you go back to classical Enlightenment thought, I'm now talking about Adam Smith and Jefferson and those guys. The sort of core idea is that people have the right to control their own work. Okay, that if a person, here I'll quote a standard formula back in the 18th century, leading heroes of the Enlightenment, is if a person does beautiful work under external command, meaning for wages, we may admire what he does, but we despise what he is, because he's not a free human being. Okay, that goes all the way through classical liberal thought, Enlightenment thought. I mean, Alexis de Tocqueville says, under wage labor, the art advances, the artisan declines. Now, you find this going right into the working class movements in Lowell and Lawrence. I think that's just natural. I wouldn't try to convince anybody of it. It seems to me if you think about it, why should you work on command? I mean, if you work on command, you're some kind of slave. Why not work because it's coming out of your needs and interests? I mean, like cheap for me to say, I'm in a fancy university in a science department and I can do that. One of the nice things about being in sciences at fancy university is you really do have workers' control. To a very large extent, we control what we do. Want to work on this topic, I work on that topic. I mean, you got to sell it to funders and this and that, but the degree of workers' control at the elite level is quite substantial. I mean, that's why it's such a privilege to be in a science department. Enormously privileged existence. Forget the money. If they paid you 1/10 the amount of money, it would still be a much better existence than working on command. Now, I think people do know that. I don't think that these Enlightenment ideas are hard to grasp. I think people know that if you work under external control, you may admire what the person does, but despise what he is, because his labor, the sort of central part of your life, is being done at somebody else's orders. And you're not controlling the way it's done, or why it's done, or how it's used, or anything else. Well, you can't have every individual controlling every single thing, but that's why you have democratic structures, because people control things together. Okay, I don't know how to. I wouldn't try to convince anybody of this, because I frankly just don't believe that everyone doesn't know it. I think maybe I'm sentimental, but it seems to me if you sort of cut away waves of layers of distortion and delusion, these things that were considered pretty obvious 200 years ago are still obvious.
What about the idea that the Cold War served certain ideological and political purposes for the U.S., and now the U.S. is seeking a new paradigm?
There's something true about the fact that the Cold War paradigm was extremely useful as a way of controlling people. So, like, say, take the labor movement. One of the ways of controlling, undermining, and destroying the labor movement was weeding out the activist elements on the principle that they're somehow not loyal enough to the state at this time of, when the enemy is at our throats. Well, like any propaganda, even the most vulgar propaganda that comes out of Stalinist Russia, there's always some thread of truth to it. You just couldn't have propaganda that doesn't have some, marginal element of truth. And there was some marginal element of truth here too, but it wasn't very real. It's like the Cuba case, So yes, this has been a very terrific hammer to use over people's heads. And it was understood, I should say. If you haven't read it yet, you should read NSC 68, which was, everybody agrees, was the fundamental Cold War document. It's kind of interesting that its content, everybody recognized it as the major document, but nobody quotes it, with very few exceptions. I'm one. But I have a book called Deterring Democracy, which in the first chapter has a lot of extensive quotes from NSC 68. It's April 1950, and it sort of laid out the basic picture of the Cold War, and it's quite fascinating to read. For one thing, because when you can see why diplomatic historians don't quote it. This was written by the real hotshots, Dean Acheson, Paul Nitze, all these smart guys. It reads like a bunch of raving lunatics, I mean, don't take my word for it. Read it. I mean, I concede I picked out the most dramatic examples, but read the whole thing if you feel like. It's not that long. In my view, it sounds like a bunch of raving lunatics, which is why nobody ever cites it. But they do make some points. I mean, the picture they tell is kind of like a fairy tale. On one hand, there's absolute evil. That's the other side. It's kind of like a fairy tale you'd be embarrassed to read your grandchildren. There's this total, absolute evil, the Kremlin, this and that, which is planning to destroy the whole world and everything that ever existed and so on. On the other side, there's utter perfection. That's us. We're like super angels. The only thing we ever do is you work, slave for the benefit of this and that. And it's portrayed in the picture of an exaggerated, a parody of a fairy tale. There's never any evidence given because it's just like a matter of definition. They say it's an essential nature of the Kremlin that it acts this way. So you don't have to even give evidence because it's just part of their nature. And it's an essential property of our nature that we do this sort of thing. Okay? So there's no evidence given. In fact, there is evidence scattered around, very carefully scattered around, so that anybody who's going to look for it is going to have a hard time finding it. And when you do put together the evidence I did in the same book, you find that it completely undermines whatever thesis they have about relative power. But forgetting that, then comes the proposals. The proposals are we're involved in a real war. It's a real war, the Cold War. We have to fight it like a war to prevent this monstrous thing from destroying everything and allowing utter perfection and magnificence to win. And in a war, you've got to have things like just suppression. We have to have suppression of dissent among us. One of our weaknesses is that we're too tolerant and too open and too free. They say that, and that's a weakness. So we have to have just suppression and control of dissent and, make sure that everybody's obedient and so on. And the way to do it is they also call for military Keynesianism. That means transferring public funds to private industry, which was a big issue then, because everybody knew that the economic system is not going to function without a tremendous amount of public funding, state funding poured in. So that was crucial. And that's true of the international economy, too, at that time, very heavily reliant on military spending to revitalize it. And they know all that, and it's laid out. But also that it would be an ideological weapon. It would be a weapon to control people. And that's true, it was. I mean, from then until the game started to go away in 1989, around then, it was a tremendous weapon of thought control. Anything you wanted to block, just yell, or do, yell Cold War. Didn't matter how crazy it was. Sometimes there was some truth to it, sometimes not. So yes, you need a new paradigm, okay? Because how are we going to beat people over the head now that we don't have that around anymore? And if you look through the 80s, it was already obvious through the 1980s that this stuff is going to lose its efficacy. You didn't have to be a big genius to figure out that the Soviet Union was in trouble. So you look at stuff, say, I was writing since the early 80s, I've been saying, look, they're going to have to go to something else. And in fact, right through the 80s, there's an almost desperate search for something else. International terrorism or crazed Arabs or Hispanic narco-traffickers or something or other that we have to defend ourselves against. Or otherwise, how are you going to control everybody? Okay, domestic crime, mostly manufactured. U.S. doesn't have crime levels very different from other industrial countries. It doesn't, in fact, but has a very different perception of crime. Welfare queens, sort of by implication black, driving around in Cadillacs and that sort of thing. So there's all sorts of effort to manufacture enemies for people to hate, but a foreign enemy is much better. So here's where the science of government comes in.